The crown was forged in gold, but it would be paid for in tears. Princess Isabella stood at the window of the palace nursery, watching her 5-year-old son Henrik play in the courtyard below, his laughter carrying on the autumn wind. In exactly 1 hour she would betray him in a way no mother should ever betray a child. In 1 hour she would sign the document that would ensure his throne and destroy his childhood. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against the cold glass, leaving ghostly prints that would fade as quickly as her son's innocence. Behind her, footsteps echoed in the marble hallway. Her husband, King Christian, had arrived for the ceremony. Their marriage had been a political masterpiece, uniting 2 warring kingdoms and bringing peace to millions. But peace, they were about to learn, always demands a sacrifice. And the powerful never pay their own debts. Their children do. This is the story of a crown that glittered with promise and corroded with poison, of parents who chose duty over love, and of the children who paid the ultimate price for decisions they never made. The marriage of nations. Princess Isabella of Nordmark had never wanted to be extraordinary. She had grown up as the 4th child of King Magnus, far enough from the throne to enjoy freedom but close enough to understand its weight. She spent her childhood riding horses through mountain passes, reading poetry in hidden library alcoves, and dreaming of a simple life, perhaps marrying a minor nobleman, running an estate, raising children who could play in the mud without protocol officers hovering nearby. But fate, that cruel architect, had other plans. When Isabella was 16, her 3 older siblings died within 2 years. First, her eldest brother Eric succumbed to typhoid fever. Then her sister Margareta died in childbirth along with her infant. Finally, Crown Prince Gustav was killed in a hunting accident that many whispered was assassination. And suddenly, impossibly, Isabella was heir to Nordmark's throne, a position she had never prepared for and desperately did not want. "You will learn to carry this burden," her father told her the night she became crown princess, placing heavy hands on her thin shoulders. "Our people need you to be strong." But Isabella didn't feel strong. She felt terrified, and that terror only deepened when, on her 18th birthday, King Magnus presented her with a marriage proposal from the neighboring kingdom of Valdoria, specifically from Crown Prince Christian, heir to King Leopold's throne. Nordmark and Valdoria had been enemies for 3 generations, their borders scarred by wars that had killed hundreds of thousands. The rivers ran red with ancestral hatred. Families on both sides had lost fathers, sons, brothers to conflicts that nobody could even remember starting. But King Leopold, growing old and weary, had proposed an audacious solution: unite the kingdoms through marriage. His son Christian would marry Isabella, and upon the deaths of both kings, the 2 crowns would merge into a single empire that would be the most powerful in Europe. "It's brilliant," King Magnus said, his eyes shining with the vision of legacy. "We end centuries of bloodshed. We create something unprecedented. You and Christian will rule an empire that spans from the northern seas to the southern mountains." "Do I have a choice?" Isabella asked quietly. Her father's expression softened, but only slightly. "You are crown princess. You gave up choice the day your brothers died. This is your duty." And so, on a cold spring morning in 1812, Isabella of Nordmark married Christian of Valdoria in a ceremony attended by every royal house in Europe. The wedding was spectacular. 3 days of celebration, fireworks painting the sky, fountains flowing with wine. The people of both kingdoms rejoiced in the streets, crying tears of relief that the killing was finally over. Peace had arrived, wrapped in white silk and sealed with golden rings. But Isabella and Christian were strangers. They had met exactly 3 times before the wedding. Stiff, formal meetings conducted in the presence of advisors and translators, where they spoke in careful diplomatic phrases and revealed nothing of themselves. On their wedding night, as Isabella stood in the royal bedchamber wearing an elaborate nightgown that had taken 4 women to fasten, she realized she knew nothing about the man she had just married except that he was 22 years old, spoke 4 languages, and had the diplomatic smile of someone who had been trained since birth never to show true emotion. Christian entered the room, equally uncomfortable, and for a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a genuine, slightly desperate sound. "This is absurd, isn't it?" he said. "We're expected to create an empire together and we don't even know each other's favorite colors." Isabella felt something. Release in her chest. Blue, she said. Like the mountains at dawn. Yours? Green, Christian replied. Like the forests after rain. He sat on the edge of the enormous bed, suddenly looking very young despite his formal bearing. I'm terrified, he admitted. Are you? Absolutely, Isabella said, and she sat beside him, this stranger who was now her husband, and for the first time she felt a flicker of something that might eventually become understanding. Their marriage began as a negotiation. They were both intelligent, both politically astute, both desperate to prove they could make this impossible situation work. They learned each other carefully, trading information like diplomats. Christian loved mathematics and engineering. Isabella loved literature and music. He was methodical and precise. She was intuitive and creative. He woke at dawn. She worked late into the night. They were opposites in nearly every way, but they learned to respect those differences, to build a partnership based on complementary strengths. And then, unexpectedly, something else grew between them. It started small, a shared joke during a tedious state dinner, a moment of genuine laughter when Christian's elaborate plan for reforming the tax system collapsed under his own mathematical error. Isabella helped him rebuild the proposal, and he looked at her with surprise and gratitude. You're brilliant, he said. Has anyone ever told you that? Usually they tell me to smile more and speak less, Isabella replied dryly. Christian's expression hardened. Then they're fools. From that moment their partnership deepened. They began spending evenings together not because protocol demanded it, but because they genuinely enjoyed each other's company. They discovered they could talk for hours about everything and nothing, philosophy and politics, poetry and science, dreams and fears. Christian confessed that he had nightmares about failing his people, about the merger of kingdoms collapsing into civil war. Isabella admitted that she sometimes fantasized about running away, about living as someone ordinary and unknown. Where would you go? Christian asked one night as they sat by the fire in their private chambers. Somewhere with mountains, Isabella said dreamily. A small cottage. I'd raise sheep, maybe. Read books, watch the sunset without wondering what political implications it might have. Christian smiled. Can I come with you to this imaginary cottage? Isabella looked at him surprised. You'd want to. I'd want to be wherever you are, Christian said quietly. And something shifted in the air between them, something warm and genuine and entirely unexpected. They fell in love slowly, almost reluctantly, both aware that love made them vulnerable in a world that rewarded only strength. But by their second anniversary, the love was undeniable. It showed in small gestures. Christian's hand finding Isabella's during tedious ceremonies, Isabella's laughter at Christian's terrible jokes, the way they moved around each other with the synchronized grace of people who had learned each other's rhythms. And when Isabella discovered she was pregnant in 1814, their joy was incandescent. They had done the impossible. They had built a real marriage out of a political arrangement, had found genuine partnership and love amid the machinery of state. Their child would be the physical embodiment of that miracle, the living symbol of two kingdoms united. Prince Henrik was born in January 1815, during the worst blizzard in 50 years. The entire capital held its breath through Isabella's 36 hours of labor, and when the announcement came that both mother and child were healthy, church bells rang across both kingdoms. Henrik was perfect, a healthy boy with his mother's dark eyes and his father's strong features. Isabella, exhausted and radiant, held him and wept with joy. Christian, watching his wife and son, felt a happiness so intense it was almost painful. We made him from love, Isabella whispered, not from duty, from love. And for 3 years they were happy, genuinely, impossibly happy. They raised Henrik together, breaking protocol by spending hours in the nursery, playing with their son, reading him stories, teaching him to walk and talk. They were still king and queen, still carried enormous responsibilities, but they protected their family time fiercely. Those hours with Henrik became sacred, a refuge from the demands of state. Then Henrik turned 3, and the Council of Nobles began to pressure them. The prince needs proper education, the advisors insisted. He must be prepared to rule an empire. This requires discipline, structure, a comprehensive program of study. He's 3 years old, Isabella protested. He needs to play, to be a child. He's not a child, Lord Stavros, the chief advisor, said coldly. He's the future emperor. Every moment wasted in play is a moment stolen from his people. The pressure intensified. The nobles wanted Henrik removed from his parents' apartments and placed in the royal school wing, where he would be educated by stern tutors according to strict protocols. They wanted him to learn languages, mathematics, history, military strategy, diplomacy, all before the age of 10. They wanted to shape him into the perfect ruler, and that shaping required distance from the softening influence of parental affection. Christian and Isabella fought it. They pushed back, argued, tried to find compromises. But the nobles had leverage. They controlled the advisory councils, influenced policy, could make governance nearly impossible if they chose to obstruct. "You rule with our consent," Lord Stavros reminded them. "That consent can be withdrawn." It was an empty threat, technically. But technically didn't matter when you needed votes to pass laws, needed cooperation to administer an empire, needed the nobility's support to maintain stability. Christian and Isabella found themselves backed into a corner, forced to choose between their son's childhood and their ability to effectively rule. "We can delay it," Christian said one night, pacing their bedchamber in agitation. "Push back until he's 5, maybe 6. But Isabella, they won't stop. And if we lose their support, if the merger destabilizes, we risk civil war. We risk everything our marriage was supposed to prevent. So we sacrifice our son to prevent a war." Isabella's voice broke. "We destroy his childhood to maintain political stability. We give him the best education in Europe," Christian countered, but even he sounded unconvinced. "We prepare him to be a great ruler. Is that really sacrifice?" "Yes," Isabella said flatly. "Yes, it is. Because he won't be ours anymore. He'll belong to the state, to the nobles, to everyone except his parents. We'll see him at formal dinners and state ceremonies, and he'll bow to us and call us your majesties, and we'll have lost him." Christian's face crumpled. "I don't know what else to do. If we resist this, they'll find other ways to undermine us. They'll chip away at every reform we try to implement. They'll block our policies. They'll turn the kingdoms against each other again. Our marriage was supposed to bring peace, Isabella. We can't let it fail because we're too weak to make hard choices." "Hard choices," Isabella repeated bitterly. "Is that what we're calling abandoning our child to prove we're strong enough to rule?" They argued through the night, their voices rising and falling like storm waves. Both were right, both were wrong. They were trapped in a system that demanded everything and forgave nothing, that required them to be perfect symbols rather than flawed humans. And in the end, exhausted and heartbroken, they made the choice that would haunt them forever. On Henrik's 5th birthday, Christian and Isabella signed the education decree. Their son would be removed from their apartments and placed in the royal school wing. He would see his parents at scheduled times, 1 hour every Sunday, plus formal state occasions. His education would be overseen by the Council of Nobles, who would ensure he became the emperor the empire needed. The day they told Henrik, Isabella thought her heart would simply stop beating from the pain. They called him to the formal sitting room, already a bad sign, since they usually talked to him in the cozy warmth of the nursery. Henrik came running in his typical fashion, boundless 5-year-old energy, and threw himself into Isabella's arms. "Mama, I drew you a picture. It's a dragon with 3 heads and it breathes fire that's actually flowers because it's a nice dragon and—" "Henrik," Christian interrupted gently. "We need to talk to you about something important." The boy's chatter stopped. He looked between his parents with sudden wariness, the intuition of children who sense when the world is about to shift. "What is it?" Isabella couldn't speak. Her throat had closed completely. Christian, his face carefully neutral in the way he'd been trained since childhood, explained that Henrik would be moving to new rooms, starting exciting new lessons, working with wonderful teachers who would help him become very smart and very strong. "But I'll still see you?" Henrik asked, his small voice uncertain. "Every day? For stories at bedtime?" "You'll see us on Sundays," Christian said, and Isabella heard the fracture in his voice despite his efforts to hide it. "And at important ceremonies, you'll be very busy learning all the things a prince needs to know." Henrik's face crumpled. "But I don't want to move away from you. I want to stay here. Mama, please, I'll be very good, I promise." Isabella pulled him into her arms, tears streaming down her face despite her attempts at royal composure. "You are good, my darling, you're perfect. This isn't about you being good." "Then why?" Henrik sobbed against her shoulder. "Why can't I stay?" And what could they say? Because the nobles demand it. Because maintaining an empire requires sacrifice. Because we're too weak to protect you from the machinery we helped create. There were no good answers. No words that could make this betrayal acceptable. Christian knelt beside them, gathering both wife and son into his arms, and the three of them clung to each other while outside the door protocol officers waited to escort Prince Henrik to his new life. That night, Isabella stood at the nursery window, watching her son play in the courtyard for what she didn't know would be one of the last times she'd see him truly happy. And she understood, with crystal clarity, that she and Christian had just made a terrible mistake, one that could never be undone. The separation was immediate and absolute. Henrik was moved to the school wing, a vast suite of rooms that were beautiful and cold and nothing like home. His tutors were strict and demanding, his schedule relentless. He woke at dawn for calisthenics, studied languages until noon, spent afternoons on history and military tactics, evenings on diplomacy and etiquette. There was no time for play, no space for childhood. He was being forged into an emperor, and the process was brutal. Isabella and Christian tried to compensate during their Sunday visits. They brought gifts, told stories, held Henrik close, and tried to pour a week's worth of love into a single hour. But it wasn't enough. They could see the light dimming in their son's eyes, could see him learning to guard his emotions the way they guarded theirs, could see childhood being systematically extracted and replaced with something harder and colder. "He's becoming like us," Isabella said one night after a particularly painful visit, during which Henrik had sat straight-backed and formal, answering their questions politely but distantly. "He's learning to hide." "Mem." "Maybe that's not entirely bad," Christian said, but he sounded hollow. "Maybe that's what he needs to survive." "Survive?" Isabella rounded on him. "He's 7 years old. He shouldn't need to survive his own childhood." But what could they do? They had made their choice. They had prioritized the empire over their son, and now they were living with the consequences. Their marriage, once so strong, began to crack under the weight of shared guilt. They spoke less, touched less, both unable to meet the other's eyes without seeing accusation reflected back. Then, when Henrik was 8, Isabella discovered she was pregnant again. The news should have brought joy, but instead it brought terror, because she knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever child she carried would face the same fate as Henrik. The machinery was already in motion, the precedent set. This child, too, would be taken and shaped and broken in the name of empire. She went to Christian's study late one night and found him bent over maps and documents, his face haggard. "I'm pregnant," she said without preamble. Christian looked up, and a complicated series of emotions crossed his face. Joy, fear, guilt, hope. "Isabella, we can't do this again," she interrupted. "We can't take another child from ourselves, can't watch another soul dimmed in the name of duty. I won't survive it. Our marriage won't survive it." Christian stood, came to her, took her hands in his. "Then we changed the rules," he said. "We've spent 3 years regretting our choice with Henrik. Let's not make the same mistake twice." "The nobles won't allow it," Isabella said. "Then we fight the nobles," Christian replied, and there was Saint Eel in his voice. "We're the king and queen. We united 2 kingdoms. Surely we can protect our own children." It was a beautiful sentiment. But as they would discover over the following months, beauty means nothing against the grinding machinery of power. The nobles had tasted control over the royal heir, and they would not give it up easily. The battle for their second child's future would consume them both, and the cost would be higher than either could imagine. The price of power. Princess Sophia was born in autumn 1823, during a season of gold leaves and gathering storms. She was a beautiful baby with her father's green eyes and her mother's delicate features, and from the moment Isabella held her, she felt a fierce protectiveness that bordered on violence. "Not this one," she promised silently. "They will not take this one from me." Christian felt the same determination. They had spent 3 years watching Henrik transform from a joyful child into a solemn miniature adult, had endured the Sunday visits where their 11-year-old son discussed political theory with the detached precision of a scholar twice his age, had felt the growing distance between themselves and the boy they loved. They would not allow history to repeat itself. "We announce it tomorrow," Christian told Isabella the night after Sophia's birth. "We're changing the protocols. All royal children will remain in their parents' care until age 12. They'll receive education, but not the brutal regimen Henrik endured. This is not negotiable." Lord Stavros and the Council of Nobles arrived within hours of the announcement, their faces masks of barely controlled fury. "You cannot simply overturn precedent," Stavros said coldly. "Prince Henrik's education has been a tremendous success. He's brilliant, disciplined, perfectly prepared for his future role. Why would you deny your daughter the same advantages?" "Because we've denied our son his childhood," Isabella said, her voice quiet but sharp as a blade. "Because we see him once a week, and he's become a stranger to us. Because I'm his mother and I barely know him anymore." "You are the queen before you are a mother," Stavros replied. "Your personal feelings are irrelevant compared to the needs of the empire." "My personal feelings are that I will raise my daughter myself," Isabella shot back. "And if you have a problem with that, you can take it up with your new emperor when Henrik takes the throne, because I can guarantee he'll remember exactly how you treated his family." It was a bold threat, but it worked. The nobles exchanged glances, calculating. Henrik was indeed being groomed to be emperor. Antagonizing his parents might create a powerful enemy in the future. They retreated, but Isabella and Christian both knew it was only temporary. The battle had just begun. For 2 years they held the line. Sophia remained with her parents, and they reveled in the experience of actually raising their child. Isabella nursed her. Christian walked the halls at night when she cried. They were present for every milestone. First words, first steps, first laugh. It was everything they had missed with Henrik, and it was precious beyond measure. But maintaining their position required constant political warfare. Every noble faction had to be carefully managed, every alliance painstakingly maintained, every potential rebellion preemptively crushed. Christian and Isabella worked 18-hour days managing the empire while also caring for Sophia, and the strain was immense. They grew exhausted, short-tempered with each other, stretched so thin they sometimes felt translucent. And then Henrik, now 13, began to notice the difference in treatment. During one Sunday visit, he watched Sophia toddle around the room while Isabella and Christian laughed at her antics, and something dark flickered across his face. "She gets to stay with you," he said quietly, "all the time." "Henrik," Christian started, but his son cut him off. "I'm not angry," Henrik said, though his clenched jaw suggested otherwise. "I understand the political situation. You fought for her in a way you didn't fight for me, and you won. I'm simply observing the facts." "We did fight for you," Isabella said desperately. "We fought as hard as we could." "But you lost," Henrik finished, "and I paid the price for your political weakness." "It's fine, Mother. I've learned not to rely on emotional attachments. It makes governing easier." The words landed like physical blows. Isabella felt tears sting her eyes, but Henrik's expression remained neutral, carefully controlled. He had learned his lessons well, too well. He had become exactly what the nobles wanted, a ruler without the weakness of human feeling. "I don't want you to govern without emotion," Christian said. "I want you to govern with wisdom and compassion." "Compassion is a luxury for the powerful," Henrik interrupted. "You taught me that when you chose political stability over keeping me with you." "I'm not criticizing, Father. I'm simply applying the lesson." After he left, Isabella wept openly. "We've lost him," she said. "He's right there, alive and healthy, and we've lost him completely." But worse was coming, because the nobles, seeing the rift between Henrik and his parents, began to exploit it. They whispered poison into the young prince's ear, suggesting that his parents' weakness, their inability to make hard choices, would doom the empire. They painted Christian and Isabella as sentimental fools who prioritized personal comfort over duty, and Henrik, already wounded and angry, began to believe them. When Sophia turned 3, the nobles made their move. They came to Christian and Isabella with an ultimatum: submit Sophia to the same educational program as Henrik, or face a vote of no confidence in the Grand Council. Such a vote wouldn't remove them from the throne, technically, but it would strip them of most governing power, reducing them to ceremonial figureheads while the nobles ruled in their name. "You're threatening us with a coup," Christian said, his voice dangerously quiet. We're offering you a choice, Lord Stavros replied smoothly. Maintain your political power or indulge your parental sentiments. You cannot have both. Isabella felt the world tilting beneath her. 3 years of exhausting political battles, 3 years of fighting for the right to raise their own daughter, and it came down to this. Lose Sophia or lose everything they had worked to build. All the reforms, the infrastructure projects, the careful diplomatic balancing that kept 2 former enemy kingdoms united and peaceful. We need time to discuss this, Christian said. You have until tomorrow, Stavros said. After that, we call the vote. That night, Christian and Isabella barely spoke. They sat in their chambers while Sophia slept peacefully in the adjoining nursery, and they both knew they were facing an impossible choice. Give up their daughter and destroy what remained of their souls, or refuse and watch everything they'd built collapse into chaos and possibly civil war. How many lives depend on us maintaining power? Christian finally asked. How many people need the reforms we've implemented, the peace we've maintained? If we lose control to the nobles, they'll reverse everything. The educational programs for common children, the healthcare initiatives, the laws protecting workers, all of it gone. How many people suffer if we choose our personal happiness? How does our daughter suffer if we choose duty? Isabella countered. How does Henrik suffer? He's 13 years old and he's a stranger to us, Christian. He's brilliant and accomplished and completely empty. Is that what we want for Sophia? Of course not, Christian said. But what's the alternative? Let the empire collapse. Let everything we've sacrificed for mean nothing. Isabella stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, the capital city spread out beneath them, millions of people living their lives depending on the stability that Christian and Isabella provided. You know what I've realized? She said quietly. We never had a choice. Not really. From the moment we married, for the throne, we signed away our right to choose our children's happiness over our subjects' welfare. We became their servants, and servants don't get to prioritize their own families. So we give her up, Christian said hollowly. We give her up, Isabella confirmed. And we live with it. Just like we've lived with giving up Henrik. But before they could finalize their decision, Henrik himself appeared at their door. He was pale, clearly having overheard the entire conversation. Don't, he said simply. Don't do to Sophia what you did to me. Christian and Isabella stared at their son in shock. Henrik, I know what I said last week, Henrik interrupted. I know I've been cold to you, distant, but I've been watching Sophia these past months, watching the way she laughs with you, the way she runs to father when she's scared, the way mother braids her hair and tells her stories. And I remember when I had that, before they took me away. I remember being loved like that. His voice cracked, and suddenly he wasn't a stern young prince, but a 13-year-old boy trying not to cry. It's the only good memory I have. Everything after is just lessons and discipline and learning to hide what I feel. They broke something in me, mother, father. They took me apart and put me back together wrong. And I can feel it. I can feel the wrongness every day. Isabella crossed the room and pulled Henrik into her arms, and he collapsed against her, sobbing like the child he hadn't been allowed to be for years. Christian joined them, and they held their son while he finally broke open all the grief he'd been carrying. Don't let them do it to Sophia, Henrik whispered. Whatever it costs, don't let them break her like they broke me. It was Henrik's pain that gave them courage. The next morning, when the nobles arrived for their answer, Christian and Isabella stood together and said no, they would not surrender Sophia. And if the nobles wanted to force the issue, they could try, but it would be the last decision they ever made. You're threatening us? Lord Stavros said, genuinely shocked. We're informing you, Isabella said coldly. You've had control over the crown prince for too long, and we're taking it back. Henrik will return to our apartments immediately. Sophia will never leave them. And if you attempt to interfere with our children again, we will use every legal and extra-legal power at our disposal to destroy you. This is treason, Stavros sputtered. This is parenting, Christian replied. And we're done pretending they're incompatible. Vote us down if you dare. But remember that Henrik will be emperor someday, and he'll remember exactly who tried to keep him from his family. It was a tremendous gamble. For 3 days, The empire held its breath while the Grand Council deliberated. Christian and Isabella didn't know if they'd still be ruling by week's end, didn't know if they'd triggered the collapse they'd spent years trying to prevent, but they had made their choice, and for the first time since their marriage, they had chosen their children over the crown. The nobles blinked first. The vote of no confidence failed by a narrow margin, and Lord Stavros was quietly removed from his position for overreaching his authority. It wasn't a complete victory. Christian and Isabella still had to make significant compromises on various policies to maintain support. But they had won the most important battle. Their children would stay with them. Henrik moved back to their apartments, and the change in him was immediate and heartbreaking. He had spent 8 years learning to suppress every emotion, to be the perfect political creature, and unlearning those lessons was agonizing. He had nightmares, anxiety attacks, moments of such profound sadness that Isabella would find him curled up in corners, shaking. He had to relearn how to be a child, and he was almost too old to remember how. But slowly, with patience and love and professional help from physicians who understood the mind's workings, Henrik began to heal. He started playing with Sophia, rediscovering joy through her eyes. He began to laugh again, tentatively at first, then more freely. He cried when he needed to cry, expressed anger when he felt it, slowly rebuilt the emotional vocabulary that had been systematically stripped away. It took years. Henrik was 17 before he could truly say he felt whole, and even then he carried scars that would never completely fade. But he was alive in a way he hadn't been since age 5, was human rather than simply functional, and when he turned 21 and began taking on more governmental responsibilities, he brought something unprecedented to the role, genuine empathy combined with brilliant strategic thinking. He had experienced both the cruelty of pure political calculation and the healing power of love, and he refused to accept that the two were incompatible. The greatest leaders, he told his parents one evening, are the ones who remember that every policy affects real human lives, that numbers on paper represent people with hopes and fears and families. You taught me that, not through your words, but through your actions when you fought for me and Sophia. Christian and Isabella, now in their early 40s, looked at their son with profound pride and equally profound regret. They had raised an extraordinary young man, but the cost had been devastating. 8 years of his childhood lost, years of pain and separation that could never be recovered. "We should have fought for you from the beginning," Isabella said quietly. "You fought when you could," Henrik replied, "and you taught me the most important lesson a future emperor could learn, that the crown exists to serve the people, not the other way around. That power means nothing if it costs you your humanity." Sophia, now 14 and growing into a thoughtful young woman, asked the question that haunted them all. Was it worth it? Everything you sacrificed, everything we went through, did it accomplish what you hoped? Christian considered carefully. "The kingdoms are united and peaceful," he said. "We've implemented reforms that have improved millions of lives. We've proven that former enemies can become allies, that change is possible even in rigid systems. In those ways, yes, it was worth it." "But," Sophia prompted, hearing the unspoken word. "But we paid for those accomplishments with pieces of ourselves," Isabella finished. "With your brother's childhood, with years of separation and pain, and I don't know if any political achievement justifies that cost. I honestly don't know." It was that honesty, that willingness to acknowledge the complexity and pain of their choices, that defined their legacy. Christian and Isabella didn't become legendary rulers because they were perfect. They became legendary because they were willing to publicly struggle with impossible questions. They created a model of governance that prioritized both effectiveness and humanity, that refused to pretend those goals were mutually exclusive. When King Magnus of Nordmark died in 1831, and King Leopold of Valdoria followed 3 years later, Christian and Isabella became emperor and empress of a united realm. They had achieved the dream that their marriage had promised. But they ruled with a constant awareness of what that dream had cost, and they were determined that future generations wouldn't pay the same price. One of their first acts as emperor and empress was to dismantle the royal education system that had traumatized Henrik. They created instead a model that balanced rigorous preparation for leadership with genuine childhood, that included professional educators but also protected family time. that recognized royal children as human beings rather than political instruments. Henrik, watching his parents systematically destroy the machinery that had broken him, felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not just for himself, but for the younger siblings that arrived over the following years. Twin boys born when Christian and Isabella were 43, a surprise that brought both joy and terror, but which they approached with hard-won wisdom. The twins, Edward and Alexander, grew up in a completely different environment than Henrik had. They were raised by their parents with appropriate support from tutors and advisors, but never removed from family life. They learned languages and history and diplomacy, but they also learned to climb trees and tell jokes and fall asleep listening to their mother's stories. They were being prepared to lead, but not at the cost of their humanity. And as Henrik watched his younger brother's experience, the childhood he'd been denied, he felt complicated emotions: grief for what he'd lost, but also profound satisfaction that the system had changed, that his suffering had meant something, had led to reform that would protect future generations. When Henrik turned 25, Christian and Isabella began preparing to transfer significant governmental authority to him. They were still relatively young for royalty, only 51 and 49, but they had learned that clinging to power too long was its own form of cruelty. They wanted Henrik to rule while he was energetic and innovative, not wait until he was old and set in his ways. The transfer of power was gradual and collaborative, a 3-year process during which Henrik took on increasing responsibility while his parents provided guidance and support. It was unprecedented in royal history. Most monarchs clung to crowns until death, but Christian and Isabella had learned that precedent was often just another word for perpetuating mistakes. On the day Henrik was formally crowned emperor at age 28, with Sophia standing as his closest advisor and the twins beginning their own governmental education, Christian and Isabella stood in the crowd rather than on the throne. They watched their son, brilliant, compassionate, carrying scars but not broken by them, accept the crown they had worn for so long. "We did it," Christian whispered to Isabella. "We actually did it. We united the kingdoms and raised children who are better than we were." Isabella squeezed his hand, tears streaming down her face. "We also broke one child and nearly broke ourselves. Let's not forget that part." "I never forget," Christian replied. "Every day I remember what we did to Henrik. Every day I carry that guilt. But I also see what he became despite it, perhaps because of it. And I see Sophia and the twins growing up whole and healthy. We made terrible mistakes, Isabella, but we also learned from them. And we changed a system that would have kept perpetuating the same cruelty forever." "Is that redemption?" Isabella asked. "Does fixing the system redeem us for what we did to Henrik?" "I don't know," Christian admitted. "Maybe redemption isn't possible. Maybe we just have to live with what we did and try to do better going forward." Henrik's coronation speech was remarkable for its honesty. He spoke about the costs of power, about the children of rulers who pay prices for decisions they never made. He acknowledged his own painful childhood, not to gain sympathy but to promise change. "Every child born into privilege carries burdens they didn't choose," he said, "but they should also receive the love and support they deserve. We can prepare future leaders without breaking them. We must." The crowd was silent, moved by their new emperor's vulnerability and strength, and Christian and Isabella, listening to their son speak truths that few rulers would dare acknowledge, felt a complex mixture of pride and sorrow. They had married for the throne and paid for it with pieces of their souls, but from that payment had come something unexpected, a more honest, more humane model of governance. Years later, when Christian was 70 and dying, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, Isabella asked him the question that had haunted their entire marriage: "If you could do it over again, knowing what you know and would you still marry me? Would you still accept the crown?" Christian was quiet for a long time, his breathing labored but his mind still sharp. Finally he said, "I would marry you again in a heartbeat. The crown? That's more complicated. We did good things, Isabella. We ended a war, united kingdoms, improved countless lives, but we also damaged our son in ways that can never be completely healed. We sacrificed his childhood for political stability. Was it worth it? I honestly don't know." Henrik says it was, Isabella said softly. He says his suffering led to reforms that protect other children, that his pain had purpose. Henrik is generous and wise, Christian replied, but children shouldn't have to find purpose in their trauma. They should just get to be children. He squeezed Isabella's hand with what strength remained. We did the best we could with impossible choices. That's all anyone can do. But I wish we'd been braver sooner. I wish we'd fought for Henrik from the beginning instead of waiting until it was almost too late. Me too, Isabella whispered. Every day, me too. Christian died 2 days later, with his family surrounding him and his legacy secure but complicated. Isabella lived another 5 years, long enough to see Henrik prove himself a truly exceptional emperor, to see Sophia become a renowned diplomat, to see the twins grow into thoughtful young men who balanced duty with humanity, long enough to know that despite all their mistakes, they had ultimately created something worthwhile. On her own deathbed, Isabella was visited by Henrik, now 42, and at the height of his powers. He held her hand and thanked her for fighting for him, even though it came late. You taught me that love and duty aren't opposites, he said. They're meant to work together. And when they conflict, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose love, even if it costs you everything else. Did it cost us everything? Isabella asked weakly. Henrik smiled, tears running down his face. No, mother. It cost you a lot, but it gave you this: children who love you, who understand the impossible position you were in, who learned from both your mistakes and your eventual courage. You gave us a better world than the one you inherited. That's the greatest gift any parent can give. Isabella died with that comfort, and her funeral was attended by thousands who had benefited from the reforms she and Christian had championed. But the people who mourned her most deeply were her children, particularly Henrik, who carried both gratitude and sorrow in equal measure. The story of Christian and Isabella became legend, but not in the typical royal fashion. They weren't remembered as flawless heroes, but as complex, flawed people who made terrible mistakes, and then spent decades trying to fix them. Their marriage had been arranged for political purposes, but it had become something real and deep. Their children had paid enormous prices for choices they never made, but those children had ultimately helped transform an empire. Decades after both Christian and Isabella were gone, their great-granddaughter, a princess named Isabella after her legendary ancestor, asked Henrik, now an elderly retired emperor, what lesson she should take from their story. Henrik, 80 years old but still sharp, considered carefully. The lesson, Inley said, is that there are no clean choices in positions of power. Every decision has costs, and often the people who pay those costs are the ones with the least power to choose. My parents married for a throne, and I paid the price with 8 years of my childhood. But they also eventually fought for me, changed systems that needed changing, created a better world for future generations. So power always requires sacrifice? Young Isabella asked. No, Henrik said firmly. That's the excuse people use to justify cruelty. The real lesson is that we should never stop questioning those sacrifices, never stop asking if they're truly necessary, never stop trying to find ways to accomplish our goals that don't require breaking innocent people. My parents' mistake wasn't marrying for political reasons, it was accepting too readily that their son had to suffer for it. Their redemption came when they finally said no more and changed the system. But they didn't save, Isabella pointed out. Not completely. No, Henrik agreed. But they saved Sophia and the twins and everyone who came after. That's how change works, through people who recognize their mistakes and ensure future generations don't repeat them. Is it fair that I was the one who suffered to teach that lesson? No. But life isn't fair, especially for those of us born into power and privilege. The question isn't whether we'll face hard choices. It's whether we'll have the courage to make those choices more humane, to fight for systemic change even when it costs us personally. Young Isabella absorbed this, then asked the most important question of all. Are you angry at them? Your parents? For what they did to you? Henrik smiled sadly. I was for many years. But anger is exhausting, and they spent the rest of their lives trying to make amends. They weren't perfect, no one is. but they loved me as best they could within the constraints of an impossible situation, and they eventually changed that situation so others wouldn't suffer the same way. That's complicated, painful, but also hopeful. Hopeful how? Because it means mistakes don't have to be permanent, Henrik said. It means we can learn, can change, can build something better even after getting it wrong. My parents married for a throne and their children paid the price, but we used that price to purchase something valuable. Reform, change, a more humane system. It's not perfect comfort, but it's something. And that became Henrik's final legacy, not bitterness over what he'd lost, but determination to ensure those losses meant something. He had been broken and healed, had paid the price for his parents' political marriage, but had transformed that pain into purpose. He ruled for 35 years with wisdom and compassion, retired with dignity, and spent his final decades teaching future generations about the complicated relationship between power, duty, and love. When Henrik died at 83, the entire empire mourned a leader who had changed what it meant to rule. His funeral procession passed millions of people whose lives had been improved by his reforms, whose children attended schools he'd created, who worked under labor laws he'd championed, and among those mourners were his siblings, Sophia, Edward, and Alexander, all of whom had been protected from the cruelty Henrik endured, all of whom carried his lessons forward. The story of Christian and Isabella and their children became a cautionary tale and an inspiration both. It reminded future generations that power always demands sacrifice, but that we should never stop questioning who pays that price and whether it's truly necessary. It taught that arranged marriages can become real love, but that love doesn't erase political responsibility. It showed that parents can be both flawed and devoted, that children can be both damaged and resilient, that mistakes can be both terrible and transformative. Most importantly, it proved that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about learning from it, changing because of it, ensuring that future generations inherit something better than what you received. Christian and Isabella married for a throne, and their children paid the price. But those children, particularly Henrik, took that price and transformed it into currency for change, purchasing a more humane future with the coin of their own suffering. It wasn't fair, it wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was human, and ultimately it made a difference. And sometimes, in the complicated world of power and duty and love, that's the best redemption any of us can hope for.